Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and it's quite an honor for me to share with you about my understanding regarding the root causes of this global financial crisis and the way out and how to prevent it to happen in the futures. And as I mentioned, I was the chief economist of the World Bank starting in June 2008, right before the global financial crisis. And in that position, certainly I need to understand what caused this crisis. And the book, the Against the Consensus, is a result of my attempt to understand the crisis and the way out. In the book, I cover 4 topics. One is the root causes, and the second one is the way out to prevent a protracted recession, and also how to turn this crisis an opportunity for a global win-win to help the developing country to grow, and also how to prevent the happening of similar crises in the futures. And today, because of time constraint, I will mainly focus on the first part. What is the causes of the global crisis and how to prevent that to happen in the future. For the global crisis, I think that a commonly accepted hypothesis was because of there was a global imbalances before 2008. And because of the global imbalances, the surplus country, mostly in East Asia, accumulated a lot of foreign reserves. And they used that foreign reserve to purchase US Treasury bill and suppressing the interest rate. Because interest rate was so low, so it stimulated all kinds of speculative activities, including in the housing, in the equity markets. And so there was bubbles in the equity market and in the housing markets. And those kind of bubbles create some kind of wealth of the households. And so because of wealth effect, they overspent. And because of they overspend, and then you have a global imbalances and so on. And because of this accumulation of the foreign reserve suppress the interest rate, and when the housing bubble burst, then it turned into the global crisis. So that was the explanation for the connection between the global imbalances and the global crisis. And if you look at this argument, logically, it seems to be very tight. And you can even build a mathematical model to show the causality. And you can run some kind of empirical test, seems to be consistent. And so it's very convincing, many people accept that hypothesis. And what caused the East Asian economies to have such a large accumulation of the foreign reserves and a trade surpluses? And for that, there were 3 hypotheses. The first one was because East Asian economies pursued export-oriented development strategies. And they exported so much. Certainly, they have a large trade surpluses. And when they have large trade surpluses, they accumulate foreign reserve. This was the first hypothesis. And the second hypothesis was after the East Asian financial crisis in 1998, the East Asian economies learned a lesson that if they did not have a large enough foreign reserves, even their gross performance was very outstanding, but they might subject to the speculative attack on their currency. And if they did not have enough foreign reserve to sell insurance to protect themselves, then they may have similar crisis as what happened in 1998. So according to this hypothesis, these East Asian economies, they had the incentive to accumulate huge amount of foreign reserve for self-protection, self-insurance, and to do that, certainly they need to export more And that was the reason why for the global imbalances. That was the second hypothesis. And the third hypothesis that was mostly widespread and commonly accepted. That was China artificially undervalued the Chinese currencies and made the Chinese export very competitive. And then China exported a lot and accumulated a huge trade surpluses. And then that turned into the huge accumulation of foreign reserve and then purchased the US Treasury bill. Again, I'd like to say, all these three hypotheses are logically consistent. You could build a mathematical model to show the causalities. And you can even assemble some empirical evidence to support that. But the question is that, are they the true causes of these global imbalances? Is these global imbalances the true cause of this global crisis? For this, I'd like to show, actually, none of them are consistent with the empirical evidence if we put it into a much larger scale of the evidences. The first one, East Asian export-led development strategies. We know that East Asian economies, since the 1950s, had already adopted this kind of export-oriented development strategies, that including Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. And for mainland China, since 1979, China already adopted this kind of export-oriented development strategies. But before 2000, East Asian economies, their trade were basically balanced. They export a lot, but they also import a lot. As a result, the trade surplus was very small. And for some economies like Korea, most of the time, they had trade deficit instead of trade surpluses. And the trade surpluses became large for the East Asian economies was a phenomena occurred only after 2000. Then we cannot use a strategy that has been used for more than half a century to explain what happened in the last 10 years, right? That's one thing. And then secondly, regarding the self-insurance motivation, as I mentioned, East Asian economies, they all had increasingly large trade surpluses, increasingly large foreign reserve accumulation. But at the same time, we find some countries, they did not have any incentive for accumulation of foreign reserve as a way to self-protection. Like Japan, Japanese yen was a global reserve currency. So for Japan, it does not have any incentive for accumulation foreign reserve for self-insurance because they can print the money and pay the debt. But we see Japan had a similar trade surpluses. The trend of the accumulation of the increase in the trade surpluses was similar to other East Asian economies, like Korea, Taiwan, and the mainland parts. In other countries like Germany's, again, Germany, euro was a global reserve. So Germany does not have the incentive to accumulate the foreign reserve for self-insurance. But as you can see, Germany also have a similar pattern of increase in the trade surplus. And not only so, almost all the developing countries at this period of time, their trade surplus increased and their reserve accumulation also increased. We know it was a zero-sum game, right? If some country try to manipulate their currency in order to increase export to accumulate the reserve, then other competing countries, their exports should be reduced, their reserve accumulation should be reduced. But we find almost every country during this period of time, they increase the trade surplus and the reserve accumulation. And also the reserve accumulation in China was too large to be explained by the motivation for self-insurance, because by the time of 2007, China accumulated 2 trillion of US dollars, and there was no need to have such a large reserve accumulation for self-protection at all. Then the third one, China's exchange rate policy. this one was most widely discussed, and it was most widely attributed as the root cause of this global imbalances and global crisis. And the accusation about undervaluation of Chinese currency started in spring 2003, first by Japan, and in the fall, followed by US. And they point the finger to the Chinese currency as the reason for the enlarging global imbalances. But if you look into the data, in 2003, China's trade surplus was only 26 billion US dollars. It was smaller than the trade surplus in 1998. It was 47 billion US dollars. In 1998, it was during the East Asian financial crisis. China did not devalue. So everyone said Chinese currency was overvalued. But even in 1998, Chinese currency was overvalued. And in 2003, Chinese currency was undervalued. Then we should observe the trade surpluses in 2003 should be much larger than the trade surpluses in 1998, but we did not observe that. Okay, the Chinese currency, the Chinese surplus became larger in 2005. And after that, certainly it continued to accumulate. But in 2005 and 2007, Chinese currency appreciated against the US dollar for more than 20%. But the trade surplus did not reduce. And at the same time, although China had a large trade surpluses with the US, but China also had a large trade deficits with other East Asian economies and other developed countries like Germany, like Japan, and so on. And so if you only look into the US trade and China's trade, then you can say Chinese currency was undervalued. But if you look into the trade with the other country, then Chinese currency seems to be overvalued. So I think that the undervaluation or overvaluation should not be a cause of the trade surplus that China had with the US and a trade deficit of China with other countries. And also, although the currency accumulation, the reserve accumulation in China is so huge, but at the same time, at the same period of time, almost all the developing countries, their trade surpluses and their reserve accumulation also increased very rapidly. And this is inconsistent because the developing countries, they are competing with others. If China intentionally undervalue its currency to create a larger trade surpluses and to accumulate the reserve, other developing countries should reduce their trade surpluses or increase their trade deficit and also reduce their reserve. But we did not observe that. So that means all these three hypotheses, as I mentioned, if you look individually, you can build a beautiful theoretical model to show the causality. And you can even assemble some empirical data to prove that. But if you put in this, the whole pictures, then you find none of them can explain all this phenomena simultaneously. So that's the reason why we need to have a new hypothesis. In my hypothesis, I try to find a hypothesis that can explain all the phenomena that we could find in the same time. And the only hypothesis that can explain all the phenomena that I report, it was this global imbalances. The root cause was in the US. And the US dollars was a global reserve currencies. But because of, not only it's a reserve currency, because of policy mismanagement in the US causing these global imbalances. We know that US started to deregulation of the financial system in 1980s. And the deregulation allowed the US financial sector to have a high leverage. And that means that they can increase their liquidities. And when you have liquidity increase, then you have more fund for making investment. They started to invest in their domestic economy, like in the housing market and so on, so housing price started to increase. And more importantly, in 2001, the burst of the dot-com bubble, U.S. should have a period of recession. But because the U.S. tried to avoid that, the Federal Reserve, reduced its interest rate from 6.5% at the beginning of 2001, 27 times down to 1% in the middle of 2003. When you have a low interest rate and a high leverage, it creates excess liquidities. And those excess liquidity, certainly, those excess liquidities encourage U.S. to have a speculative investment in the housing market and so on, and causing the housing prices started to rise. And at the same time, certainly also happened in the stock markets. And when the housing prices and the equity value increase, the financial deregulation and innovation also allow the U.S. household to capitalize the gain in the housing market and equity market and to increase their consumption. And the empirical data show, U.S. in 1990s, the household debt as a percentage of their disposable income was about 70%. But by the time of 2005, 2006, it increased to 130%. And so certainly you have an overconsumption in the US. In the same period of time, because of the Afghanistan war and Iraqi war, the US also run fiscal deficit. When the household had a deficit and the government also have deficit, certainly it turned into some kind of trade imbalance. US turned into the US trade deficit. And China, after 2000, became the major providers of the consumption good in the US. And that was the reason why when US run a large trade deficit, China started to run a huge trade surpluses. And this excess liquidity not only affected the US housing market and the equity market and the consumption pattern. This excess liquidity also encouraged US financial sectors to have a carry trade, to make investment in abroad. So you can see after the 2000, there was an increase substantially in the outflow of capital from the US to the developing country. In 2000, the capital outflow was $200 billion US dollars. By the time of 2007, it increased $1.2 billion US dollars, a 6-time increase in the capital outflow. And this kind of capital outflow to the developing country certainly encouraged investment that grows. And so you can see the developing country after 2000 entered into a period of acceleration in their growth rate. And when the developing country, their growth rate increased, certainly they will demand more capital goods for the investment. And that was the reason why some high-income countries like Germany, like Japan, they increased their export because they were the major producers of the capital goods. And this kind of acceleration in investment and consumption in both the developing country and in high-income country certainly increased the demand for raw material, for oils and so on. And that was also the reason why we observed after 2000 and so, the global commodity prices started to rise very quickly. And that turned into the trade surpluses in the developing country, especially for the resources intensive, abundant countries. And since the US dollar is the global reserve currency, no matter the US dollars was accumulated through the current account surpluses or accumulated through the capital account inflow, the developing country could not use those kind of US dollars domestically. They needed to turn that into their local currencies for making investment or consumption. And so when they convert the dollar accumulated through trade surpluses or current capital account surpluses, it will become the foreign reserve accumulated at the central banks. And when the central bank hold this kind of reserve, if they just put that in the safe, then they won't earn any return. So they use those kind of reserve to purchase U.S. Treasury bill. And so you see the outflow of the reserve from the developing country to the U.S. And a lot of hypotheses about the causes of the global crisis. They only looked at the flow from the developing country to the U.S., but they forgot to see the flow from the U.S. to the developing country. And actually, the whole picture was because the U.S. has a mismanagement in their domestic policies and causing the wealth effect and overconsumption, and the U.S. government run a deficit and also encourage the speculative outflow. And this was possible because U.S. dollars was the reserve currency. Certainly, it's a reserve currency now. So I think that's the whole story. And during this period of time, how come China stood out? How come China also accumulated such a large reserve? Certainly, there's some reason for that, because China oversaved. And why China oversaved? It was because of some distortion in the Chinese economy, especially China adopted a dual-track approach for the transition. And the Chinese government retained quite a number of distortions in the financial sectors, in the resources sectors, in the service sectors. And those kind of distortions caused the income distribution favor the rich people and large corporations. And when you have wealth accumulation in the hand of the rich people and the large corporations, certainly their consumption propensity is low, and their saving propensity is high, and that was the reason for China's over savings, and that also contributed to the reason why China accumulated such a large trade surpluses as well as the foreign reserves. But fundamentally, if there was no U.S. to print the money to start with this kind of cycle, even China had this distortion domestically, the result will be just redistribution of the trade surpluses from one developing country to China and accumulation of foreign reserve from other developing countries to China. And the possibility for all the developing countries to increase their reserve, the only possibility was the reserve issuing country increase their money supply, and through what I described, the financial deregulation as well as the expansionary monetary policy after 2001. And what is the way? I'm quite pessimistic about the global economy. And I think that if we want to avoid the protracted new normal or the lost decades, it's very important to create a space for the high-income country to implement their structural reform. And the way to create a space for their for the possibility for them to implement the structural reforms, here in my book I propose to have a global infrastructure investment fund like the Marshall Fund. Because of time constraint, I'm not going to elaborate that ideas. And if you want to make investment in the developing countries, to make this kind of infrastructure become self-depletion, then developing countries should have high growth rate, dynamic growth rate. And is that possible to have the developing country to have a dynamic growth rate? In my third part of the book, I discuss my ideas of new structural economics, and the government plays some kind of facilitation role for the developing country to develop according to their competitive advantages and to tap into the potential of the advantage of backwardness. And if they can do that, certainly they can grow much faster than the high-income countries, and especially because the income in China increased, and China will entering into the same pattern as Japan in the 1960s and East Asian economies in the 1980s, That means China needs to relocate its labor-intensive manufacturing sectors to other low-income countries. And that will open a window of opportunity for almost all the low-income countries to start their industrialization. And if they can start that process, certainly the investment in the infrastructure will make that kind of opportunity become possible, and will also generate a high return for their investment. That's my third part of my book. Okay, so from my discussion, from my analysis, it is because of the US dollars. It's the global reserve, a major global reserve. And it made it possible for the US to run the trade deficit for such a long time. And the US, use its global reserve status combined with the financial deregulation of 1980s and the low interest rate policy in the 2000s, causing this emerging, of the global imbalances, and that was the causes of the global crisis and as well as the global imbalances. And so, how to avoid that in the futures? Because fundamentally, the reason for this global crisis was the conflict of the national interest of the reserve issuing country with the interest of the global system. When the US run the monetary policies, its main concern is domestic economies. And very often, when they have mistakes, the cost will be the global economy. And so if we want to avoid this, we need to find a substitute of the reserve currencies. And currently, the most widely discussed reserve currencies is special drawing right. But I think the special drawing right did not solve the issue, because special drawing right is a basket of national currencies. And so each national currency still have the conflicts of the national interest rate, national interest, and with the global interest. So it did not solve the issue. And I proposed a new supranational currencies along the line of Keynes' thinking in the 1940s. Keynes proposed something called the banknote. Now I propose something called the paper gold. And this paper gold is a fiat money issued by some kind of global monetary authorities. And according to the K percentage proposed like Milton Friedman, or the revised version by Taylor's. And this kind of paper gold has the advantages like the gold, and has the advantages of a supranational currency, so it does not have the conflicts of national interest with the global interest. And since it's fiat money, so it can increase proportionally to the increase in the real economy or in the trade, so it can avoid the trouble of using gold as a reserve, because if you use gold as a reserve, or any commodity as a reserve, then in a very dynamic growing global economy, then there is a tendency for the deflation. But if you use the paper gold or fiat money, it doesn't have that problem. And this paper gold can also avoid the same problem that we are having now in the Southern European country. Because Southern European country, they use euro as the currencies. So they did not have independent national currency. But for the paper gold, it's a reserve currency. And each country, they can issue their own national currencies. So if they encounter some kind of crisis like what happened in the Southern European country, they could use devaluation as a way to increase the export and as a way out for their crisis. So this paper gold have all the can avoid all the problems that we, can conceive of now, and it will be a much better currencies, a reserve currency, than to use the national currency as a reserve currencies. But certainly, whether this kind of supranational currency will be accepted or not, We know that Keynes' proposal was not accepted in 1940s in the Bretton Woods conference. But at that time, US economies contributed to more than 50% of global GDP. And the US also, was a rising power. So people had confidence on the US economies. And so that was the reason why, in terms of design, Keynes' idea was much better than using US dollar as a reserve currency. But, after the US proposed to use US dollar as a reserve currency, everyone accepted that. But I think that looking forward, US is likely to contribute to maybe less than 15% of the global GDP by the time of 2020s or 2030. China may contribute to the global GDP at a similar amount. And then the euro also will contribute to the global GDP at a similar amount. So there was no dominating power in the coming decades. At the same time, I think that most likely, most countries will continue to have some kind of structural problems. And so if you use the national currency as a reserve currencies, it's likely to be very unstable because every country, they run their monetary policy for their own domestic purpose. And if they have a structural problem, all kind of economic problems at home, then very likely their monetary policy will contribute to the instability of the global system. And that kind of instabilities will be bad for every country, including the reserve currency country and a non-reserve currency country. And because it's a bad solution for every country, so there's a possibility some kind of better currency arrangement will be accepted in the futures. So I published my book in a Chinese version called 从西潮到东风. It was published last year. And the English version was released just this month. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You suggested this paper gold money, but there are several emerging alternative forms of currency, and I'd like to get your view on projects like the Bitcoin, and other sort of virtual currencies.
I did not fully get your question.
No, there are other forms of currencies that are emerging. There's a company that floats Bitcoin. Have you heard of this project?
I did not.
Bitcoin.
I did not know the project.
I see.
But because if you want to have a currency to become a global reserve currency,
right,
you need to accept it by all the countries in the world.
Sure.
And if a company try to issue currencies, I don't see the possibility.
No, this is not really restricted to one company issuing this currency. It's sort of a global virtual exercise that this company is trying to propagate. And there are a lot of projects that revolves around local economies, local exchanges, local currencies. Interested in getting your view on how this your concept of paper gold relates to those projects.
I don't know the project, so I'll be very happy to see the project. And if you can provide some information about the project, I'll be very happy to compare my proposals and their designs.
Dr. Lin, I think regarding the SDR, can we look at euro as a currency, as a proxy for SDR? And if we do that, the current crisis that's going on in Greece and Portugal, is that going to be equivalence of what's to come if we relinquish the right to print paper currencies?
Well, I think SDR and the euro is different design. In the euro, the Southern European country, they did not have their independent currency. And in the past, when a country encountered a financial crisis, they could use devaluation as a way to create a space for their structural reform. Because we know that in general, structural reform will be contractionary, reduce the demand, and also they may enter into a period of recession, and that may cause their unemployment rate to rise further. And to compensate for that, in general, the IMF would recommend for the country to devalue their currencies in order to increase export and to create a space for the structural reform domestically. And for the Southern European country, because they use euro as their currency for the domestic circulations, and because they do not have independent currency, they could not use devaluation as a way out. And for the special drawing right, there was no such a problem. Because for the special drawing right, every country can still retain their own independent currency. And so if they encounter some kind of crisis, they could use devaluation as a way to create the space for the structural reform. But the trouble with the special drawing right, it was a basket of individual currencies, including US dollars, Japanese yen, euro, and in the future may also include the Chinese yuan. But it's individual currencies. And when you use the national currencies as as a component in this basket, this kind of arrangement does not solve the issue of the conflict between the national interest with the global interest. If a country within this basket, they have some kind of domestic troubles, they may also use expansionary monetary policies. And that kind of expansionary monetary policies will have some kind of implication as what we observed in the US before the financial crisis. So it does not solve the fundamental problems of using national currencies as the reserve currencies.
Hi, Professor Lin. I'm pretty interested in the proposal as a paper gold. So would it be like a derivative of gold or like issued by the Federation or Union of a group of the major governments in the economy, or just like it's backed by a basket of major resources on the earth? Thanks.
Well, the paper gold, as I mentioned, is a fiat money. Just like now in most national government, they issue money, but they didn't use anything to back it. And it's different from the banco proposed by Keynes. When Keynes proposed its supranational currency, and Keynes linked the supranational currency to a basket of commodities, including gold, and grain, oil, and all other things. And if you link this, issuing of the supranational currency with a basket of commodities, then it will have the same trouble as you link the currency with the gold. Because as I mentioned, that if you issuing your currency based on certain kind of commodities, no matter it's gold or a basket of commodities, it has a tendency of deflationary pressure when you are in a very rapidly growing economies. But for the paper gold, it doesn't have a trouble because its growth, the growth of the paper gold, can be decided by a group of experts. And this group of experts can decide the growth of this paper gold according to certain percentage of the increase of the growth in the real economy and the trade. And if you have those kind of arrangement, it can avoid the trouble of linking your currency and issuance with the real commodities.
We have time for one final question.
Dear Professor Lin, thank you for your outstanding presentation. Recently, I'm reading an article on Financial Times. It's an author talked about your views on investment still play a major role during China's development. I don't think the article makes complete sense. Do you want to say something to define it to support your views? Thank you.
Very good. It's one of my favorite topics because, I returned from the World Bank in 2012. And at that time, domestically, most economists say China needs to turn from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. And the reason why people make that kind of argument was for two reasons. The first one, because globally, that during the global financial crisis, international communities always said one reason for the global imbalances and the global crisis was over-saving and over-investment in China. And if China wants to have balanced growth, China needs to reduce the saving and investment to increase consumption in order to contribute to the global imbalances and also balances in China. But as I mentioned, in my analysis, the causes of the global imbalances was not the over-saving and investment in China. It was over-consumption in the US. And so under the kind of situation, even China, the reason of the global imbalances was not in China, so there's no reason why China need to be responsible for that. That's one thing. And secondly, whether over-saving and investment in China was the main reason for the global imbalances, we can use some kind of further evidence to show that. From 2008 and 2012, China's investment and saving further increased, but the trade surpluses reduced from about 10% of GDP down to now only about 3% of GDP. And how come that investment and saving in China further increased, but the trade surplus in China reduced? It was because the US consumption reduced. During this global financial crisis, we know that US household has some kind of deleveraging, and so that they reduce their consumption, and that causing the trade surpluses in China to be reduced. And my second, response to that kind of analysis. And thirdly, most importantly, China, certainly consumption is important for any country. But I argue consumption should be the purpose as well as the consequence of the growth. Because if you do not have a growth, if you do not have an increase in productivities, and you increase your consumptions, then the increase in the consumption needs to be financed by the debt. And if it is financed by the debt, it cannot be sustainable. And if we want to have growth, certainly we want to increase labor productivities. And if we want to increase labor productivities, we need to come from the technological innovations and industrial upgradings. And technological innovation and industrial upgrading all need to use investment as a vehicle. And secondly, if we want to have economic growth, when your productivity improved and a scale economy enlarged, you also need to improve the infrastructure to release the bottleneck for further growth, to reduce the transaction cost. And infrastructure improvement also need to have investment. So that's the reason why for any country, if they want to have a rapid economic growth, then investment would be the driver for those kind of economic growth. But in China now, many economists think that the way to have a dynamic and a sustainable growth is to use consumption-led growth. And for that, I can agree. Okay.